Afghanistan is a difficult country in many aspects, and difficult honestly doesn't really cover it. Afghanistan is a very mountainous country. Almost 3/4 of its surface is covered by mountains and peaks that in many cases exceed 20,000 feet. So you can probably imagine just how difficult communications are among the different regions of this country. And as if this was not enough, it's also a landlocked and mostly arid place. In fact, deserts are not unusual at all in Afghanistan. So despite a few valleys, its national landscape is mainly composed of red and yellow tones. But geography is not the worst part of this country, and neither is its harsh climate conditions. Not at all, in fact. Poverty, corruption, and especially fundamentalism and violence are the worst parts of this place. Afghanistan, dear viewer, above all, is a country of war.
In 1978, the Sour Revolution, a communist-based revolution, took place. 1 year later, in 1979, the Soviet army invaded the country to consolidate the communist government.
Since then, the people have not known what peace means. But before, to be honest, the situation, it wasn't really good either. Afghanistan was, is, and probably will be for a long time, one of the poorest countries on earth. It's also got one of the hardest and most hostile living conditions, especially for women. In this country, 6 out of every 10 people don't know how to read or write, almost half of its population doesn't have access to drinking water, and it's difficult to find a single family which hasn't been devastated by war and violence. We can safely say that if someone was able to choose where they were to be born, no one would ever choose Afghanistan. The last great conflict, which still persists to this day, it burst onto the global stage in October of 2001, when the President of the United States at the time, George W. Bush, decided to invade Afghanistan as a response to 9/11. At that time, Afghanistan was led by the Taliban, a radical religious political group which protected members of Al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The invasion, it was fast. The Taliban simply weren't an obstacle for the massive American war machine. 16 years and 3 presidents later, though, and it has been named by many as the longest war in US history. It's already longer than the war in Vietnam. And believe it or not, the US, they're not winning that war.
What's happening?
16 long years of conflict, occupation, and hundreds of billions of dollars later, and it would seem logical to think that the US and NATO could have managed to have the situation under control and Afghanistan would be close to reaching peace, right? Well, nothing is further from reality. The truth is that with each day that goes by, the Taliban regain ground. Just take a look at this map from the Washington Post. The colored areas are the ones controlled by the Taliban. And, well, this map shows the situation at the beginning of 2017, but today things are even worse because, as we just said, the Taliban are regaining ground almost every day. The most recent estimates show that the government of Kabul, US and NATO control less than 60% of the territory, and the next map is going to show even more Taliban-controlled regions.
The Afghan government controls just 57% of its territory, US Watchdog says.
But the loss of control by the Afghan government, and thus the US, shouldn't be just seen as a territorial loss, but also an economic loss. For example, it's really important that we ask ourselves, how can the Taliban finance their activity? Where do all of their resources come from? Well, basically, that would be from heroin production. Yep, as you might know, Afghanistan is the biggest opium producer in the world, and this opium, well, that's the raw ingredient that is used in heroin. And listen, Afghanistan is not just the world's biggest producer, it controls between 80 and 90% of opium production globally.
The opium comes from Papaver somniferum, the most popular plant among the Afghan opium farmers. In this country, most of the population lives off farming.
We can say that most of the Afghan economy relies on 2 fields, that's international soldiers and opium. In fact, there's little more to their economy than that. So for quite a while, the Taliban have controlled the opium production in this country. But now they also have realized that they can produce the heroin themselves, which is a much more profitable activity. And, well, that's exactly what they're doing.
Everything they harvest is duly processed inside the country. They receive more revenue if they process the opium before it has left the country. William Brownfield, U.S. Assistant Secretary for Drugs and Law Enforcement.
Estimates show that the Taliban could be raising about $3 billion every year from this, and that's despite all the money that the US has wasted trying to stop these activities, an effort that, as you can see from this chart, hasn't been at all helpful. So, despite all the effort made by the US, opium production remains at very high levels. As a consequence of having all of these resources, the Taliban, they're managing to sustain a war that is not just allowing them to regain ground, but has also plunged the country into violence. And worst of all is that future predictions, they're not very good.
The Taliban are getting stronger. The government is on the retreat. They're losing ground to the Taliban day by day. Abdul Jabbar Kahraman, a retired general.
Listen to this. The Taliban army has increased from between 2,000 to 10,000 soldiers in 2005 to more than 60,000 today. But at this point, the question must become, why is the US losing this war? Or at least, why aren't they winning?
Hello, Bagram!
The Afghan trap.
The United States has tried many different strategies in Afghanistan, but it seems that nothing is working. In fact, generally speaking, there's quite a lot of pessimism over this conflict. And this is not just a matter of more or less soldiers. When Barack Obama was a candidate for president, he repeated all the time that Afghanistan was a war they need to win.
We did not finish the job against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We did not develop new capabilities to defeat a new enemy, or launch a comprehensive strategy to dry up the terrorist base of support. We did not reaffirm our basic values or secure our homeland. It's time to turn the page. When I am president, we will wage a war that has to be won. Barack Obama.
When he arrived to the White House, he deployed 100,000 soldiers and another 40,000 from NATO. Even so, nothing changed. Many experts say that the problem is that President Obama insisted all the time on an exit plan with a troop withdrawal calendar, which is sort of like saying to the Taliban, hey look, don't worry about any of this, it's all temporary. But beyond that, although the soldiers from the international coalition gained ground, they couldn't gain influence. And now the question is, why is that? Well, first of all, we're talking about a tribal country with a culture of consolidated violence. It's not easy for international troops to gain people's trust and be able to distinguish civilians from enemies, or even just know what's happening on the ground. The cultural leap is absolutely huge, and having suffered so many years of violence means that the Taliban have plenty of experience. On the other hand, there's the corruption and the lack of credibility in the local government. We can safely say that the Afghan government has a total lack of institutions which can provide anything to the Afghan people, and while there are a very few that do exist, they are extremely corrupt. In fact, this is one of the most corrupt countries on earth.
Ordinary Afghans don't like the Taliban, but they dislike the Afghan government even more. People don't die for an army, they die for a country. And who wants to die for the current Afghan government? Dexter Filkins, New Yorker reporter.
With all of this considered and also adding in the fear of the Taliban, it's easy to understand why every month almost 4,000 soldiers and policemen desert the government of Kabul. Further, we have to say that the strategy the US has taken with the Afghan government, the politics and the institutions, it hasn't worked. Washington hasn't even made the Afghan military able to function, with the exception of the Special Forces, which is formed of 17,000 elite soldiers. They are the only ones who are really fighting the Taliban. Barack Obama understood that the war in Afghanistan was something that the Afghan people should carry out, though the US would be the one paying the bills.
Today I signed a historic agreement between the United States and Afghanistan that defines a new kind of relationship between our countries. A future in which Afghans are responsible for the security of their nation.
Among all the problems, we also have to add in 1. Pakistan, who is being accused of providing support to the Taliban, and 2. An economy which doesn't work at all, and then there's 3. A lot of concealed interests. For example, have you thought about what interests Beijing, Tehran, or Moscow have in this war? One thing is clear, these countries don't want Afghanistan to be an American colony. Because of all of this, after 16 years of war, the battle, it continues. But now at the Oval Office, there's a new president, Donald Trump.
A huge mistake?
Trump has been saying for years that the war in Afghanistan is a huge mistake and that the US has to get out of there. He said it, of course, through his favorite communication medium, and that would be Twitter. He repeated it again and again in 2011, 2012, 2013, all the way until his 2016 campaign.
When will we stop wasting our money on rebuilding Afghanistan? We must rebuild our country first. It's time to get out of Afghanistan. We're building roads and schools for people that hate us. It's not in our national interest. Do not allow our very stupid leaders to sign a deal that keeps us in Afghanistan through 2024, with all costs by USA. Make America great. Now Obama is keeping our soldiers in Afghanistan for at least another year. He is losing 2 wars simultaneously.
And it's not just Twitter. Trump insisted again and again and again that Afghanistan was a mistake. Have a look at this.
Afghanistan is a total and complete disaster. What are we doing? Get out of Afghanistan. We've wasted billions and billions of dollars, and more importantly, thousands and thousands of lives.
And of course, in the presidential campaign, he promised he will get the US out of Afghanistan if elected. But, well, now that he's president, well, things they seem to be rather different.
Trump's new position.
On the 21st of August, in the military base of Fort Myer in Virginia, Trump explained his brand new strategy, and, well, let's just say that everything he's been saying for years, well, it came to nothing. Trump's new strategy is so similar to Obama's that it's really quite difficult to differentiate them. Trump announced more troops, but not that many more. Basically, the contingent will increase from 12,000 to about 16,000. The training of the Afghan military and the fight against terrorism will become a priority. More money will be spent, corruption will be battled, and there will be more pressure on Pakistan. So, in other words, more of the same and nothing that the US hasn't done before. The main differences from Obama's strategy, though, are twofold. First, there won't be a withdrawal calendar, and second, Trump seems not to be interested in building Afghan institutions. In fact, with the budget cuts on the State Department, Trump seems to rely more on arms than on politics. And it's not clear what Trump plans to do with 16,000 soldiers that Obama couldn't do with 140,000, or how he thinks he can stabilize a country without solid and reliable institutions, which could gain local people's trust and allow for some economic development. I mean, the average age in Afghanistan is around 18 years old, which is an incredibly young population, and this youth nowadays can't work and doesn't have any future apart from what the Taliban can offer them. If Kabul or Washington are not able to build a framework of opportunities for these people, the end of violence will be very far away. So the question must be, is Donald Trump aware of this?
It's going to be only America first. America first.
So, 16 years, more than $800 billion, and thousands of military and civilian losses later, and the United States is still bogged down in what many call the Afghan trap. And the truth is that Trump doesn't seem to propose anything different. Without institutions, and without a multilateral willingness which must include Afghanistan's neighbors like China, it seems very hard to believe that weapons are going to be enough. And now it's your turn. What do you think the US should do in Afghanistan? It's a pretty big question. You can leave us your opinion in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos every Monday and Thursday. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine, and as always, thank you for watching.
My original instinct was to pull out, and historically, I like following my instincts. But all my life, I've heard that decisions are much different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office. In other words, when you're President of the United States.